Okay, let's start with something simple. One day when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was riding the bus through downtown with my father when he told me to get up. I'd been sitting by the window and I'd been looking outside, so I knew we hadn't reached our destination yet. But he stood up, I stood up with him, and when I looked in front of us, there were two women. They smiled, they each said thank you, and then they sat in the seats where we had been sitting. Now, I don't know what my visible reaction was, what my face did in that moment, but my father leaned in and said, "You did good. I'll buy you some ice cream." So on the way home, we stopped by McDonald's. He made good on the ice cream promise, and he introduced me to the word chivalry. Now, the word chivalry was new to me, but the concept was not. It pretty much fit in with the way that I had seen my father treat my mother. It was very much in line with the way that I had seen men in my community treat the women in my community. And as a young boy who wanted to emulate these men, I went about doing these chivalrous deeds. Didn't question it. Now, as a boy, I was doing these things for women who were obviously older than me. And they all showed appreciation. They always said thank you. But what I noticed was that the older women, and I mean the women old enough to be my grandmother or maybe great-grandmother, were effusive with their praise. And just, "Oh, you're such a sweet boy. Oh my gosh, your parents raised you right. You must not be from around here." And I mean, they just laid it on thick. Older women always said thank you, but the young women always said thank you, but the old women just really, really appreciated it. Now, as I got older, I began doing these things for women my age. And they said thank you most of the time. Probably, 95+% of the time they said thank you. But sometimes they didn't. You might hold a door, somebody might just breeze past you. And I remember having a few of those moments and thinking to myself, why am I doing this, or do I want to keep doing this? And I gave it some thought, and it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion that, yeah, I wanted to keep doing it. One, because I've been doing it all my life, and it had just become part of me. And two, because I wanted to present that kindness, that courtesy to the world. And, I had to dispel the notion that I should be worried about any sort of gratitude or anything, because it may or may not come. And so I continued to do it until I became a middle-aged man, as I am today. And now I'm doing these things for women my age, and equally for women who are much younger than me, women who could be my daughter's age. And what I find is that they say thank you maybe half the time, and I might be being generous with that. I've just come to stop expecting any sort of, forget gratitude, just even acknowledgement of what you've done. I've had women just not even look up from their phones. I've had women not look in your direction. You don't even get a head nod or, thank you, a gesture or anything. And, I've gotten accustomed to it. And again, I reconciled myself that I was going to keep doing what I was doing a long time ago. But that brings us to earlier this year. I was leaving my local chicken nugget establishment, And I was walking out behind a young man who may have been in the 18 to 20 range. And as he got to the door to leave the restaurant, there were 3 women coming from separate directions, independently. They were not together. And he opened the door, stepped outside, and held the door. I was on my way out, but recognized the women were coming in, so I stepped to the side inside the door to allow the women to pass through. The first woman passed through and said nothing. The second woman passed through and said nothing. The third woman passed through and said nothing. And so by the time they had passed and I walked through, I said thank you to this young man, but I could see the look on his face. He looked defeated. And I mean, mouth agape, shoulders slumped, just like, what the heck? And I had to stop and tell him, I said, listen, you did the right thing. And that's what you need to keep doing. Don't worry about them. Don't worry about anybody who doesn't acknowledge that you did a good thing. Listen to me, you did a good thing. Now, I don't know whether or not this young man will continue to do these good things. Apparently, he had it in him through training or through his own presence of self to do this. But, you know, I came across him one time and tried to encourage him. I don't know if that was enough to keep him going. Who knows? But I recognize that we don't reinforce this idea of chivalry so much in our young men. These days, I see boys with their mothers, for example, who will rush to the door, open the door, and let the door close and let their mother close the door. And I often will stop them and say, hey, is that your mother? And they say, yeah. I say, listen, you're supposed to get the door for your mother. And sometimes the women notice, sometimes they don't. But in the cases where they notice, they usually, yeah, you should do that. And maybe they never thought to teach their sons. Maybe they thought their sons were too young. Maybe they thought somebody else would teach them. I don't know. But I do mention it. But as much as I'm aware that these boys are not getting it the same way that I got it, it dawns on me that young girls are not being taught the appropriate way to receive chivalry as well. And that might be a problem. Or if I'm being intellectually honest, I have to say, maybe it's not a problem. There's a possibility that I am an old man who is seeing the world changing around him in a way that I don't understand, but it's not really a problem. Maybe Generation Z and Generation Alpha will decide, hey, we don't need to hold doors open for women, you know. We're all the same. Gender is a spectrum. And everybody's just going to get their own door. First come, first serve on the seats, whatever the case is. And maybe they will all just be okay with it. And the way that I used to do things, the way that I was taught to do things, is just an anachronism. It just doesn't even matter anymore. That might really be the case, but I hope not. And here's why. Is because as I grew and matured, I recognized that being chivalrous was of benefit to me personally. It was a distinguishing characteristic in some cases. It set me apart. And in particular, if I was trying to impress a young lady, it just, showed her that, I was somebody who was trustworthy and respectful and whatnot, and maybe gave me a little competitive edge over somebody else who was, in competition, but not putting forth that same effort. But I also recognize that it has a societal benefit. If you go to a community where men routinely hold the door open for women, it sends a very strong and clear signal to the women in that community that you are generally safe around the men here, that the men respect you, we got your back, that you don't have to fear us or worry about us. And in an era where so many women are willing to choose the bear, maybe it's good to have it as a community-wide thing that women can relax around men. Now, I don't mind telling you that I wish that black women should feel safer nowhere than they do in the presence of black men. And even as I say that, I'm sure some of you think I'm naive. I like to think I'm idealistic, but that seems to be true. That seems to be the way it should be. Not true. That's the way it should be. And fortunately, I live in a community where this tends to be the case. Men still tend to do these little courtesies for women. And even with regard to other men, just showing that respect, holding the door open, greeting other men is a good way to just grease the wheels of our social interactions. It cools the temperature. It just says to everybody, hey, everything here is cool. So that if something happens, there's a slight, or somebody bumps into you or steps on your shoe, there's no need to swell up because it was an accident. Everybody here is cool. And so I hope we don't lose chivalry for that reason. I don't know if we are. Maybe this is overblown in my mind. I don't know. I really would like to hear some other opinions if you guys have them. Am I dead wrong in my observations? Am I making a bigger deal out of this than I should be? Is this just the world changing and I just got to accept it? I appreciate you all listening to all 13 and a half minutes of this. Anyways, I'm gonna let you go. I appreciate you checking me out. Peace.